In this video series on Babe Ruth, I analyze every single season the Babe played to try to figure out what awards he would have won if they would have been around when he played. Before the Babe was the Sultan of SWAT, he was a full-time pitcher for the Boston Red Sox. Thus far, I've determined that he would have been the Rookie of the Year in 1915. He would have just narrowly won the Cy Young Award in 1916, and the Red Sox won the World Series that year as well, and Ruth was probably the second most valuable player in that series. The following year in 1917, I've determined that Ruth would have probably finished third in the Cy Young voting. Those are the only 3 seasons in which Ruth pitched full-time. 1918 was a year of transition for Ruth as he would split duties between towing the rubber and playing outfield. And that meant Ruth was going to swing the stick a lot more often. In fact, while he only had 142 plate appearances in 1917, that number would jump to 382 during this season. As we try to figure out what awards Ruth could have won in 1918, we have to begin with the retro Cy Young voting, and that discussion begins with the big train, Walter Johnson. Johnson was spectacular during the 1918 season, and there's no difficulty in declaring him the retro Cy Young winner for that season. In the 25 categories that I analyzed, he was number 1 in 13 of those categories, and he finished in the top 10 in 24 of 25 categories. He not only had 23 wins, but he posted a 1.27 ERA and tossed 8 shutouts along the way. And if that didn't impress you, well, maybe this will. Johnson started 29 games and he threw 29 complete games. And to top it off, on May 15th, he threw an 18-inning, 10-hit shutout in a 1-0 victory. What a dominant game. What a dominant season. The question is, with Ruth only pitching half-time, would he even finish in the top 10 in the Cy Young voting? Well, I have Ruth coming in 7th in the Cy Young voting, and in case you think I'm being too favorable towards Ruth, the guys at the This Great Game website have Ruth coming in 6th. I think it's fair to ask how a halftime pitcher could actually finish that high in the Cy Young voting. Well, here's how. Simply put, Ruth was just difficult to hit. During his rookie season, he had the second best hits per 9 in the league. In 1916, he was number 1. In 1917, he was number 3, and things really just weren't that different in 1918. He finished 4th. He was also second best in the league in both whip and win-loss percentage, and among the 25 categories that I analyzed, he finished in the top 5 times. He also finished in the top 10 14 times. And of course, of those 25 categories that I analyzed, some of those are counting stats, and there's no way that Ruth was going to finish among the leaders in some of those. In other words, when Ruth pitched, he was highly effective, as his 18 complete games speak to. But we can't ignore the fact that the league leader threw 332 innings, and Ruth threw almost exactly 50% of that. If it wasn't for that, I'd have Ruth ranked 6th in the voting, but I have to take that into consideration, and that's why I have him ranked down at 7. Well, as we think of the MVP award, we have to think about who the best hitter was in the American League. And in 1918, that was none other than the Georgia Peach, Ty Cobb. Cobb was a beast, hitting .382 and having an on-base percentage of .440. I looked at 35 categories for hitters, and Cobb led in 14 of those. Nobody else even came close. In fact, he was first or second in 21 of the 35 categories. My rankings were very similar to the guys at the This Great Game website. We had the same top 6 players, with Cobb finishing at the top, and we both had Ruth finishing 5th. I guess that gives me a little comfort in my ranking. So what we have here is that Walter Johnson's a runaway winner for the Cy Young Award, and Ty Cobb was clearly the best hitter in the league. What does this mean for Cobb and Johnson's chances at the MVP? And more importantly, what would that mean for Babe Ruth? It's important to understand, I have Ruth ranked number 5 as a hitter for a reason. He finished first in 6 categories, including slug, OPS, home runs, and extra base hits. He even finished second in 12 categories, including on-base percentage at .411, doubles, and OPS plus. He had a monster season, even though he was only a halftime hitter. In trying to understand Ruth's chances at the MVP award as a halftime pitcher and a halftime hitter, it's helpful to remember that Ohtani won the MVP in a similar role in both 2021 and 2023. Although it should be noted that Ohtani had a lot more at-bats than Ruth. Because Ohtani's 2023 campaign was slightly better than his MVP season in 21, I'm using the 2021 1981 season as a comparison for Ruth. Ruth tossed 166 innings, which was 50% of the league leader, and while Ohtani threw about 2/3 of the innings of the league leader, Ruth still threw 36 more innings than Ohtani. But Ohtani had about 250 more at-bats than Ruth. But of course, part of this is attributed to the fact that in 1918, the season was cut short because of World War I, so Ruth would have had a lot more at-bats if they had played a full schedule. And Ruth didn't have the DH at his disposal. And because of that, there can be no doubt that Ohtani had a greater contribution to his team on a regular basis. Yet when we compare them side by side and think about what they did league-wide, Ruth was clearly a more effective pitcher than Ohtani was. And it's really not even close. And when you compare them as hitters, they look very similar, except Ruth comes out ahead in leading the league in one more category, and he also came in second in one more category. But besides that, they look very similar. This graphic details how they finished in their hitting in the top 5. And it's remarkable to see that Ruth led the league in home runs in spite of only having 65% of the plate appearances of the league leader. So while Ohtani had a greater contribution on a regular basis, Ruth made the most of his at-bat opportunities and league-wide did just as much damage as Ohtani did. By the way, I have intentional walks highlighted in red because those weren't tracked until 1955, and that's why I track Ohtani in 36 categories as compared to only 35 for Ruth. As stated previously, Walter Johnson is clearly the Retro Cy Young Award winner for 1918, but I don't find his 1918 campaign as historically great. Now the 1913 season, that's a different story. Johnson finished 36-7, posted an ERA of 1.14, and listen to this. His whip was .780. That's a historic season. And again, Ty Cobb was clearly the best American League hitter in 1918. And by Ty Cobb standards, this was another great year, but not really close to being one of his greatest years. I mean, Cobb hit 400 3 times, and in 1911, he had his greatest season. He scored 148 runs, collecting 248 hits along the way. In the end, he hit .419 with a slug of .620. This was a ridiculous season and definitely one that we could call historic. What I'm trying to say here is that Johnson had a great year and Cobb had a great year, but we would never call them historic seasons. But what Ruth did in 1918 was historic. He was the 7th best pitcher in the league, and by my rankings, the 5th best hitter in the league. And as you can see here, I've really only got him ranked 5th because he wasn't a full-time hitter. When you look at the statistics here, you could easily rank Ruth as the number 2 hitter in the league, but you have to consider the fact that as a half-time hitter, you just can't rank him that high. But when you throw in his pitching exploits, Ruth put together a historic season, and he definitely deserves the Retro MVP award. And we need to remember that Ruth was the star of the Red Sox who led them down the stretch to the pennant. Alan Wood notes that over one 10-game period in July, Ruth hit .469, and coming down the stretch over his last 11 starts, he threw 9 complete game victories, including the pennant clincher game against Philadelphia. He was the most valuable player on his team and an emerging two-way superstar. I checked my decision up against both Bill Dean and Stats Inc., and they also had Ruth as the Retro MVP of the 1918 season. Well, thanks for watching, and in the next video, I'll evaluate who should have been awarded the MVP award in the 1918 World Series. As usual, I appreciate it when you like this video and subscribe to my channel.